All right, good evening, everybody, and welcome. This is Carlos Clanton. I'm Vice Chairman and Ward 3 member of the Norfolk City School Board, and I want to welcome you all to Live with Carlos Clanton tonight for our session entitled Beyond the Tipping Point, When Discontent Turns to Anger. I'm so excited for the guests that we have with us this evening, and so I wanted to start off with an introduction here. Our world is reckoning with a pandemic for which there is currently no cure. Already, COVID-19 has taken nearly 100,000 plus lives. And so already COVID-19 has taken 100,000 plus lives in the US, and it has consumed millions more worldwide. We mourn for all those who have been affected by this crisis. In a very short period of time, the pandemic has shifted everyone's reality, and none of us are ever going to be the same. While COVID-19 has unleashed a threat to the health and the economy of this nation, it has also revealed to the pre-existing condition that places all of us at greater risk. The hierarchy of human value, and to be more specific, racism, that has served as an activator that has accelerated the loss of life and disproportionate losses of significant populations in our country. Persons of color, who are in many cases workers with low incomes, live in places where are already struggling, are suffering great physical, economic, and social harm. Currently, there is no cure for this health pandemic, nor for the social pandemic. While we are one human family, both conditions aim to separate us, both aim to weaken us, and both aim to dehumanize us and threaten our well-being. Again, welcome to This is Live with Carlos Clanton. I'm really excited to have our guest here. We have guests that are still hopping on. As you know, a lot has been happening in the Commonwealth. And so I'm going to bring in some of the guests who are here with us this evening. And so they're going to start popping in here in just a second. And so I'd like to introduce to you all, I call him my pastor, big brother, but this is Reverend Dr. William Marcus Small, who is the senior pastor of the New Calvary Baptist Church in Norfolk, Virginia. Welcome, Pastor Small.
Hey, man, thank you very much for having me, man. I appreciate it. It's a pleasure to be here and to share. We got a lot to talk about.
Definitely appreciate it. And so my next guest that I'd like to introduce and bring on is none other than Councilwoman Angelia Williams-Graves, who represents us on the Norfolk City Council, representing Super Ward 7. Councilwoman, welcome.
Thank you so much, Carlos, for having me. It is an honor to be here with you, and I am excited to have the conversation.
Great, thank you. The next
and
guest,
hey, Pastor Small.
Our next guest that I like to bring on is none other than the Honorable Dr. Wes Bellamy. He is the former vice mayor of the city of Charlottesville, Virginia, and he now is the political science department chair at the Virginia State University. Welcome, Dr. Bellamy.
State. Thank you for having me, Brother Carlos. Good to see my friends and family. How you doing? The Honorable, lovely Miss Graves and Pastor Small. Thank you again, Brother Carlos, for having me. Appreciate being on.
I appreciate it. Thank you all. We have others who are joining us. As you know, things are moving here. And so they will be brought into the conversation as we move. But I just want to start off with the activities of today. A lot has happened just in this one day. And so I want to get your perspective in regard to the Robert E. Lee Memorial monument there on Monument Avenue in Richmond, Virginia, being taken down today. And Councilwoman Graves, I'm going to follow up and have you to be prepared to talk about what we've seen in the newspaper regarding the city of Norfolk's plans to remove our Confederate monument downtown as well. But I'll start with the Robert E. Lee. And I'll share in this respect. It was probably 2000. I was a part of the Young Democrats, and my road buddy was none other than the late Maria LaPresto. And Maria and myself had to go to a event, and there was a parade in Richmond, and so the road was closed off. And so I was driving her car, and so she's a white female sitting in the car with me. This is the first time I had ever gotten pulled over and gotten a ticket. And it happened to be right there at Monument Avenue where there was a detour and I didn't see the sign. I got pulled out of the car and this had never happened to me before. And I will have to say that at that particular moment for myself, I had this sense of fear, like, you know, what's going on? I've I'm driving and I'm being pulled out of the car, and it's the sense that a lot of African American males have when they're approached and being in a situation with police. But that monument's being said is being taken down today. So what do you all have to say about that? And I'll start with you, Reverend Small, because you never lost words.
Well, I think what happens is when we talk about monuments and things of that nature, I think the symbolism is incredibly important to have them removed. And what we are talking about, or what people are talking about, is some type of change in regard to the culture or the atmosphere. And although I applaud what's taking place, we all know that the mentality is much deeper than that. That the level of hatred and the level of prejudice and bigotry is a lot deeper than that. What you spoke of in terms of your first experience at getting pulled over is a trauma. And we're talking about that and understanding that. And I think more of us need to understand that it is a trauma that happens to the psyche of the African American person in this country. And we need to really talk about the different kinds of traumas, right? We need to talk about the statues that remind of oppressive times. We need to talk about, not just flags, but the other images and ideals that continue to limit us or that attempt to limit us and remind us of the current state that we're in. And so it does speak to a changing and the shifting of prayerfully of some mindsets.
Definitely. Anybody else? Dr. Bellamy?
Sorry, I was on mute. One, I think many people know this is it's very personal for me, for everything that's transpired in Charlottesville, and standing there today with Governor Northam, Mayor Stoney, and Lieutenant Governor Fairfax, and others from across the Commonwealth who've been on this journey. I think it shows, one, when we think about things, I remember, let me just say this, I'm kind of lost for words because it's so emotional. I remember people saying in 2016, when we in Charlottesville, and me at the time being the only Black person on the council, and essentially getting the fire for people saying, you're going to ruin our city, you're going to ruin our state, and traveling around, and people saying, like, these statues will never be removed. This wasn't an issue. Those laws will never be changed. This is the capital of the Confederacy. In my opinion, it feels to a certain extent like we did take one of the rocks that God gave to David, and we threw it at Goliath, and we definitely dropped him to his knee. Now, we didn't knock him out, because white supremacy isn't deterred or knocked down just by symbolic measures. However, it does show a very powerful message. It does send, rather, a very powerful message when you have these idols, and these nodes to white supremacy being removed, again, in the capital of the Confederacy. I think there's a psychological shift that we begin to see for us to begin to think about not only pushing bold and progressive policies, but thinking outside of the box in terms of things that people thought would never happen, actually happening in present day during our time. I would agree with Reverend Small when he says that there's still a lot more work to do. And I know in Charlottesville, one of the things that I would always say when I was in office is that it's my job to walk and chew gum simultaneously. So it's my job to address the symbolic measures of white supremacy statues and monikers across the community and remove those expeditiously as we can. But furthermore, it's also my job to be able to work and advocate for policy change. So we wrote something known as the equity package, which was essentially $4 million in resources to underserved and specifically Black communities. They had GED training, public housing redevelopment funds, job training, a litany of different things. And then furthermore, we followed that up with the business equity fund, in which we were able to provide up to $250,000 in a pot, and any Black-owned business who wants to have access to those resources can get up to a $30,000 loan at a 1% interest rate. And again, you can do that while also advocating to remove these statues. And I think that's what it takes, addressing the symbolic while also addressing the policies. And it's our obligation to do so, and we will do so, and we will continue to do so, as been exemplified by all of the folks, not only in this panel, but across the state.
Definitely. And so I'm going to pause for a moment because we have some additions I want to bring into this conversation right now. And so I want to go ahead now and to bring in our Lieutenant Governor, Justin Fairfax, into the conversation. Welcome, sir.
Thank you so much, Brother Clanton, and thank you to this extraordinary panel. I was just listening in to Dr. Bellamy to spend some wisdom, and I see you have Councilwoman Graves, who's an extraordinary leader, Norfolk, and a dear friend, and Dr. Small, thank you for all that you do around the Commonwealth of Virginia and your incredible moral leadership. So I'm honored to be with you. My apologies for being a few minutes late. I was with Dr.
busy day
in Richmond. There's a lot going on, so we had a whole bunch of interviews, but did not want to miss this opportunity.
Well, I appreciate it. And we're going to come back around with this particular question that we asked. I'm going to go ahead and bring in State Delegate Jay Jones. Thank you, my good brother.
See you later. Good evening, everybody. Sorry I'm a little late too, but I'm happy you guys are still going.
Definitely. And last but not least, for this particular point here, we'll be bringing him in on the second segment there, and that's Marquise Hunt, who is a youth activist and a part of the NAACP Youth and College Division. Dynamic young man, and I'd love to be able to hear. He's also been on the front lines marching, and so Marquise will look forward to bring you into this conversation. But to restate the question, and I'll go ahead and direct it to you, to our Lieutenant Governor. So what is the significance of the removal of this monument today? And I'm quite sure that it wasn't just something that happened today, but there had to be a backstory behind it.
Absolutely. Well, I think this is the culmination of the work of so many extraordinary people over, many, many years. And I was very proud the governor announced today that he would be removing the Robert E. Lee statue from Monument Avenue in Richmond. And I think it's really a defining moment in our history in the Commonwealth of Virginia and really for our nation. We're saying that we are finally going to tell the truth about, who we've been as a Commonwealth, about the fact that our history is interwoven with the history of slavery and Jim Crow and segregation, Black codes and massive resistance. That's not, a bug, but it's been a feature of who we've been as a society, and that now we're finally going to deal in a very honest way with the truth of that. And just like in other countries like South Africa and other places where you've had this kind of history, you cannot get to reconciliation unless you first tell the truth. And I think that's what this moment really symbolizes. And I said also today at our press conference that this is a very significant action symbolically and otherwise, but to me, it's also a down payment on a much larger series of payments, of policy changes, of legislative changes that have to be enacted, because we all know, and you have some great leaders, and I want to thank Delegate Jones for joining and for his great leadership as well, the General Assembly and elsewhere. We know that we have living monuments to the Confederacy. We have living monuments to slavery, and those are the substandard schools that exist all around the Commonwealth of Virginia that our Black and brown children are forced to walk into every single day, where the roofs are falling in, where the water is leaking, where there is mold, where there is not technology, where the teachers are not compensated, there's no AP courses, and there's no hope and no opportunity. We also have living monuments in the form of an unequal healthcare system, where Black and brown people have worse health outcomes in almost every conceivable category, substandard housing that exists all around the Commonwealth of Virginia, a broken criminal justice system. And we recently did a justice summit where, we highlighted some of these issues, where Black youth are overrepresented in our penal system by over 3.5 times, Black adults by more than 3 times in our prison system here in the Commonwealth of Virginia. So these, to me, are the living monuments that are not bronze and stone, but yet flesh and blood, because these are the things that allowed that oppression to be passed down from generation to generation to generation. And so what we've got to do is, even as we tear down those physical monuments, we have to tear down the living monuments that exist every single day in every one of our communities. And I think that that's what these extraordinary leaders have done from day one, and in communities all around Virginia, whether it's Charlottesville, Norfolk, Hampton Roads, Richmond, South Side. It exists everywhere. Southwest Virginia, parts of Northern Virginia, and the Valley. Eastern Shore has struggled with so many of these issues for so long. So we are all tied up in this together. And the only way we're going to get out of this is by working together. But we've got to be bold. We've got to be courageous. And we've got to speak even in the face of opposition and tell the truth and say, this is the direction that we're going in for the next 400 years. And so these symbolic acts, which are significant, must be followed up with us tearing down those living monuments to that oppression that existed and started here in the Commonwealth of Virginia 400 years ago. And that can change here in Virginia, in the place where it started. So that's what all this work is all about. And I'm grateful to join with such incredible leaders who stand up with that kind of courage, who make substantive change to our laws and to our policies, which change the lives of our children and our grandchildren. And that's really what this fight has been all about.
Definitely. And so for those who are tuning in, I'd encourage you in the comment section on either one of the feeds, feel free to ask questions, make comments. We'll be able to share those a little later on as we continue. But I am now going to definitely pivot over to Councilwoman Graves, because I think that this is important. Norfolk, it's not new. It's been some time. We've been trying to move this monument, but because of state statute, I do believe, we were unable to do that. But the General Assembly was able to do some things. So Councilwoman Graves, what's the significance here in Norfolk in removing that monument downtown?
Well, I think it is symbolic, but I want to just touch on a little bit. I watched some of the press conference earlier today that the governor did. And one of the things that struck me was, I believe it was Robert E. Lee's great grandson. Do I have enough greats in there? Great grandson.
Yeah.
Great times three grandson.
Four greats nephew. Yes.
Four greats nephew. Okay. I thought that was incredibly symbolic for a number of reasons. And it kind of touches on something that Pastor Small said. And that is, we can take down a monument. We can put up a monument. I mean, we take down this one monument in Norfolk. We've got another monument to Dr. Martin Luther King, who is a peaceful, prolific member of our society who is responsible for a great deal of change in the civil rights movement. But until we start to change the hearts and minds of people, these acts are going to still be met with some other act of resistance or defiance or whatever you want to call it. And so why I felt so, I guess, some kind of way about the great nephew of Robert E. Lee is because it's like, when you do rehab, right? In order to solve the problem, you have to admit there's a problem. And so by him being there, to me, that was him saying, I'm admitting that my family was wrong, that my great uncle was wrong, and that this is not right. And I'm admitting that, and I am laying that down, and I want to be a part of the solution. And so I like I said, we can take down monuments, and by all means, I am definitely in favor and full support of taking down the monument in downtown Norfolk. I can honestly say to you, for a number of years, I drove clean past that monument, didn't have a clue as to what it was. I mean, I'm just in my car on my way, going to where I'm going. It's a statue, and I'm not stopping to pay attention to it until one day I had lunch at a hot dog cart and actually saw it and started to read it and understand what the plaque and what the monument was all about. Other than that, it had been a piece of stone to me. And so then you go, well, why is this? And I think at the time, we didn't even have a Martin Luther King monument up when this happened. When I realized what this other thing was, we didn't even have a Martin Luther King monument. And it took decades to get that. So I think that, until we start to talk to each other, until we start to see each other as human beings and acknowledge the pain, you might not have done it. Our white counterparts who are living in 2020 may not have done it, but you have to acknowledge that it was done. And acknowledging that it was done goes a long way with acknowledging me as a human being, acknowledging my pain, acknowledging my anguish, and then saying, how can I help you? What can I do to help you? Because it goes beyond removing the monument.
Drew Brees learned that the hard way today.
He gonna get sad.
He learned that the hard way today.
So, Delegate Jones, you're here, and I'm glad to have you. You represent two different fronts. The respect being a millennial, being one of the youngest members of the General Assembly, and also being a representative in our lawmaking body. of course, the lieutenant governors in the upper house, the upper chamber with the Senate. But when we look at as we begin to kind of look at some of the things, this was a dynamic, a whirlwind of a General Assembly. I mean, there were a lot of major wins and changes and things that were sweeping through Virginia. But when we start looking at the laws, because that's really where it comes to, and we're going to talk about, and Chief Larry Boone is going to come in here and we'll talk about the protests, and because people have to realize that there really is a three-legged stool in this thing. There is the activism, there is the advocacy, and there's the policy making. And so many of you all represent that policy making front. And so Delegate Jones, I throw it back to you. What are some of the things that you can foresee, or that we could be making policy changes in the Commonwealth moving forward?
Yeah. Well, thank you, Carlos. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm sorry I was a little late, but I didn't want to miss this, and that's a great question. And I'll tell you that it doesn't just start today. It started in the last couple of years. I think as we examined our history here in Virginia, 400 years of challenging history, really decided, I think, to make a change and to really reassess who we are and what we want to project and put out to the rest of not just the state, but this country. And so I was very pleased last year when the governor created his commission to examine racial inequity in the law. And over the course of the last year, that the group of people put together an entire group package of laws that really needed to come off of our books. I don't think people realize that there were still plenty of things in our code that were memorializing segregation and Jim Crow and the Black codes. I mean, I carried a couple of these bills. There was still a law in the books that banned having Black folks on train cars and rail cars. And so these systemic things that have been baked in for so long, I think we had sort of taken a view that we didn't need to touch it. But I think that was a big start. As we go forward, I have told everybody who will listen, I'm so happy that folks are getting out and being active and protesting and making their voices heard. But the bigger challenge comes on the back end when we go back to Richmond to address these policies. And I foresee we will have a full and comprehensive review of how police use force, whether that says, okay, look, we're going to have civilian review boards, we're going to have a Marquise alert, we're going to make sure that there are de-escalation training programs for all of our officers, not just when they're trained, but on an ongoing basis. Just like we require of our school resource officers in school, who are very much law enforcement figures as well. We think we're going to probably look at continuing to de-police our schools in a way that we will make our children safe, but also make it much more conducive to a learning environment and less like a prison. We have seen over the course of decades and generations, honestly, that progress has been stifled, but we want to use this moment. We want to make sure that George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor and Philando Castile and Trayvon Martin and Eric Brown and Michael Garner did not die in vain. And I think that as they are above us with our angels, they're looking down saying, please use this moment to continue to push forward. And so we've got a whole host of ideas. I think everybody in the legislature is chomping at the bit to get back as soon as we can to really make these formal changes to the law. But I think Councilwoman Graves is right. And when she's talking about what Dr. King said is that, look, you've got to change hearts and minds too. And so we can put things on the books, but we've got to make sure that we are institutionalizing them in people's minds so that, a child who's growing up today doesn't have that same outlook and worldview that folks who are growing up, before us had. And so I've challenged some of my white colleagues to say, look, I want your child to go to a school that is integrated, right? That has more than just one or two races, so that they are exposed to a diverse number of cultures and experiences, because that's what makes us strong. And that's what makes our state, the wonderful place that it is. And we know that it can be, but it's an ongoing project, right? It's never going to be one legislative session with a set of laws and we say, okay, we're done. This is our charge. This is our mission to continue to bring this country and the state up to speed. Right, 400 years is a long time, and we want to make sure that as we go forward, we're putting ourselves on a course that we feel is going to properly reflect where we've been, but put us toward where we're going to go.
Definitely. And so I'll circle back around because I think.
Can I just say something real quick? That I think when you talk about, and I think what Brother Jones is saying is so significant, because I think when you think about and you talk about what the subject matter is today in terms of the tipping point, right? It suggests that that something has become too hard or too much to bear, right? And so as a result of it being too much to bear, there needs to be legitimate adjustment, right, in what's taking place. And part of the tension that we're running into is that when we look at the dynamics of power, some of our white brothers and sisters are reluctant because they're so afraid of what takes place and what can take place in the power dynamic, and what they're afraid they're going to lose. And what we have done, and I'm talking about African Americans, what we have done, quite honestly, is we have trusted the system too much. We have trusted that it's going to work. We have trusted that it's going to be okay. We have trusted that if the rules, such as they are played by, then things will begin to then work out and lean in favor. But there's a spirit, if I can, behind it that continues to manipulate it. Right. So you can't. So to say we have on camera, right, somebody putting their knee on somebody's neck until they asphyxiate and die, and there's still a possibility that because they are a police officer they can get off. That's not about system. That's about a spirit behind it, right? And we need to understand that. And so there are people who can massage and people who can move. So we need people like Jay in those places. We need lieutenant governors. We need people on school boards. We need Angela Graves on councils. We need Dr. Bellamy's in classrooms, awakening minds to see the system and how it works. We need preachers and clergy to talk about, these things in a sense of information and wokeness, if I can use that terminology, because it has to be a collective in terms of the change and transformation that happens in the system, that is going to come from us. It's not going to come from somebody else. And we need to get over that. We need to build that bridge and get over that. It's not going to come from other people. And we need to get over the fact that we're the first one. We need to get over the fact that we're the only one in the department. We need to get over all of that if it does not mean there's actual transformation and change in the system in which we're trying to evolve in.
Great points there. And so we see a new face that has joined this conversation. And I tell those who don't know Marquise Hunt, this is one dynamic young man who has a story. And it really is my first question to him. Marquise, what led you to get involved? Because I see you in your black, so I take it you were a little late getting in here. So I dare to say, were you out protesting somewhere?
I'm protesting in the house right now because there's an advocacy piece that comes with the outside piece too. So definitely making sure that we keep those things in mind. But the way I got involved was a couple of years ago. A young man who was 18 years old at the time was shot and killed outside of a Walmart parking lot in Portsmouth, Virginia, by the name of William Chapman. And that was also a time where the narrative across the country was young people, unarmed, Black, were doing completely nothing wrong, and we're still being targeted by those who are employees of the government, of which I call police officers, who are supposed to protect and serve those in that community, but yet for some reason thought that they were supposed to be a part of the judicial process and determine right then and there whether or not you were innocent or guilty. And so, and of course, that's the same narrative that we're seeing now, where with just this past week, we've seen George Floyd and for 8 minutes and 46 seconds, yell he can't breathe, that his stomach hurts, and eventually crying for his mother to his very last breath, where he was accused of having a counterfeit bill. And most people will make the argument that the issue is about the counterfeit bill versus a man who lost his life due to police violence. Exactly. And so there's a systematic, as Delegate Jones mentioned before, through the educational system, but even through many other systems that we see, it's all cyclical. And so when we see and recognize that there's a system in place that has a history of these certain acts towards a group of people, then I think at the same time we definitely need to make sure that we recognize what our role and responsibility is through generations to kind of combat that same system. Because the reality of it is, some folks have asked me, well, what are the next steps? And I'm like, well, I'm only 21 and you're asking me what the next steps are to combat a 401-year-old system. I don't have the answer right now, but there is work in progress that we all can make towards this progressive change.
Don't say that. You are the answer, right? You being 21 years old, and I know you. I begged him to move to Norfolk so that he can come take my seat. Okay,
I can help him find the house.
You are the answer, right? You are what your ancestors' wildest dreams are, right? You are involved at a young age, like I was, like Angela was, like Carlos is, like Wes is, and we want people just like you to reach out to your friends and your colleagues and your neighbors, because it can't just be those of us who are in elected office, right? It's got to be a community-wide effort. It's got to be you activating your friends and your networks to continue to press, because what we often see happen is that after a week, the news cycle changes and everyone's attention gets diverted elsewhere. But it's you as the young group of people who've got the energy, who've got the passion, who continue to press and make us have these uncomfortable conversations, right, with our colleagues and with our neighbors and all of that. And that's how the good policy comes, is great conversations over the course of the year or the weeks or the months to get us to a better spot. But when I hear you, I see you out, marching and protesting peacefully, that is one part of it, but it continues on, and you've got to continue to do that, because we can only do so much, but it's much easier if we're doing it together.
Can I jump in and add something, Carlos, to that?
Yeah.
It is not by accident. I don't believe it is not by accident that this happened with George Floyd during the time when we had this pandemic. You said it, Jay, when you said usually there's something that happens, there's a march, there's a protest, and then everybody goes back to work. The next thing happens on the news and blah, 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 blah. Well, we've been cooped up like chickens, right, for the last couple of months. Nobody's at work. Nobody's at school. We couldn't do anything. We couldn't go anywhere or any of that, right? So to me, it's not an accident that his death happened when everybody was at home watching television. And then college students didn't have classes, didn't have finals, maybe had homework, but you know what I mean? People were laid off from work. They were working from home, so you could take your phone and protest and walk down the street and still work from home. You could do whatever if you were laid off from work, you could protest. There's a reason why this is not going to go away and there's not going to be another news cycle. It's because so many people are out of work and are out of school, and this is what their focus is, and they have the time to do it. And so it's a blessing in disguise that it happened this way, because we have the people who, for lack of a better word, don't have anything else to do and don't have anywhere else to go. And this is their moment and their opportunity to be able to put in the work and put in the time and not let the news go to the next cycle and forget about it and brush it under the rug.
Definitely. So I'm going to do this here. We've got Chief Larry Boone, who's waiting to come on. And so Delegate Jones, I'm going to take you out for a brief moment here. Don't go.
That's okay. I got to go.
There's some questions lined up here that Sharice wants you to answer. So we'll come back to that. But I'm going to go ahead and bring Chief Larry Boone in, because I think it's important now to really hear about the police perspective. And most importantly, you heard about a whole lot of violence and things that were going on and riots and so forth, but why were things so different in Norfolk? And so I like to bring our chief in and to talk about some of the things that he's been doing, not just at this because it was a reactionary thing, but what he started from when he moved in. So I'm going to take you out, Jay, and we're going to bring in the chief. Chief Boone, it's good to see you, sir.
Can you hear me?
We can hear you, sir.
All right. We had about 20 minutes of technical difficulties, so we went through various laptops and iPhones and everything else. Nonetheless, I think Norfolk had a different outcome because, we started doing some heavy lifting about maybe 5-6 years ago, right before Ferguson. And one of the things we recognized is that we didn't have any real, authentic connection with our challenging communities. So we've put together a host of programs, initiatives. I won't go into all of them. Most of you are aware of them, but those initiatives have been recognized nationally, internationally, and they've done us a great deal. We have programs that address individuals from 5 to Greg, but more importantly, as it relates to those that are in charge of doing protests, we reached out to them. We didn't wait like some other agencies to the day of the protest. We had meetings with them. We've had lunch. We talked about various things. We had difficult conversations. I got most of them in my cell phone, and we communicate before the event itself, and we kind of lay down the law of the land. And we've been fairly lucky so far. They've kind of, for the most part, adhered to some of the things we agreed upon.
Not lucky, that's your leadership.
Trying to be humble. But you got to talk to these young men. You have to talk to them, and you got to be able to show them that you can connect with them, not just by color, because some of us aren't very culturally competent. You have to be able to explain to them that you understand, not just by your words, but by action as well. I knew when I stepped out on those steps of the Police Operations Center that was a defining moment, okay? Whether or not we were going to have peaceful protests or violent protests. I knew when I held that Black Lives Matter sign, that was a defining moment, also potentially a professional career ending moment. Because where I stand as an African-American police chief, I have to be able to weigh both sides. I have to be able to maintain the trust of my rank and file, as well as the community. And what I explained to them, because I did get some concerns, a little bit of pushback, Black Lives Matter. What that means to me is that when you consider all the trigger points, the indicators, we're typically, those indicators that are positive, we're typically at the bottom. And those indicators that are negative, we're typically at the top. And what I explained to my rank and file is that's what Black Lives Matter means to me. It's not just about law enforcement. It's about health, housing, education, all those things that have historically adversely impact the African American community. So we've done a heavy lifting early on, and now the kids, thankfully, they're starting to recognize that we do things a bit different. And we're very lucky that we have women and men of this department that adhere to my philosophy, because I can tell you if they didn't, it would be entirely different than what has displayed thus far.
So, Chief, very good there. I'm going to bring Jay Jones back in to the conversation. But I think you, I think I read something, or even one of your interviews. What do you do when you have, you're the chief, you're the top, but it's a lot of times the issues are on the front line with officers who are doing normal patrols. How do you weed out? How do you fix those problems within? I know it starts from the top. But how do you fix a problem like that when you get those type of complaints or situations that are going on?
So when we early on, when we recruit, we try to recruit the best people, and sometimes that's challenging. Okay, but when we recognize there's an issue with an officer, particularly if they're not one that will fit nicely into our philosophy, we don't hold on to them. We put a lot of pressure to bring out some of those challenging behaviors that they may have with respect to race, with respect to their perception of the LGBTQ community. with respect to women. And if we see indicators that they're not going to be a good fit, we don't keep them. I'll work short before I work bad. So this line of work is so stressful that it will highlight those type of personalities. You know, we also want to get away from the Action Jacksons type that you know, they come into specific communities and they see everybody as a threat. We don't need that type either. What we need are officers that have a procedural justice mindset, okay? That they're going to give folks opportunities. One of the things I do the very first day of procedural justice training, I go in there and I talk to them about some of the challenges in Norfolk, some of the challenges historically about law enforcement surrounding race. I talk about slave patrol. I talk about Jim Crow laws. I talk about Norfolk 17. I talk about all those things that will give them an idea why they may go into a certain neighborhood and people don't always embrace them because we have history. A lot of those folks, their grandparents are still living. And one of the things I share with them is that we got to give folks and our communities at opportunity. I always say opportunity. I don't like saying at risk because everybody folds their arm up and go in their respective corners. I say that opportunity because you want to give these folks opportunities to have a chance. And I share my story, you know, having been incarcerated a couple times as a juvenile. And I always say, you know, you never know what might have happened with me had I not gotten that second, sometimes third chance. So that's kind of what I try to instill in my officers. But I also tell them, let anybody hurt you as well.
Appreciate that. So I'll throw it back here and just kind of, you know, we've talked about the police here, but in the very beginning, Wes, you talked about this being an issue, a topic that was very dear and near to you, and being the former vice mayor in Charlottesville, witnessing what you witnessed. What do you think when we start to see the TVs? And of course, we're seeing all these protesters, and in many respects, many of them have been peaceful, but in some respect, you've also had some individuals who've kind of infiltrated and done some other things. But what do you feel is like the flashpoint? You know, at this particular point, you know, the whole topic here today is talking about when we get to a point, you know, it's just a tipping point, and people, and I think Councilwoman Graves brought it up, you know, people have been cooped up. But when I think about this, and I'm mentioning about two pandemics, we have a health pandemic, and then we have this social pandemic that's here. But in many respects, folks are, and I've seen it, you know, they're not, you know, they're wearing their masks and then some are not. They're putting their lives at risk because they're so passionate about something, even in the midst of this pandemic. But, you know, what do you feel as though this, you know, we're at this flashpoint, and what are some of the things that we could probably do to move forward?
Well, that's a great question. I think there are a couple of things. One, individuals like ourselves have to continue the conversations, one in the dialogue. We have to continue to be willing to be bold and go out in the street and meet people where they are. We have to be willing to continue to be bold in our respective circles to also push not only our friends to be uncomfortable, but push ourselves to be uncomfortable, not only to learn about ourselves, but learn about the systemic issues. When you ask about the flashpoint, I think that we're seeing, as Councilwoman Graves alluded to, it's like the perfect storm of sorts. This is divine. And personally, when we talk about moving forward, I guess I'm saying something sooner than I should, but I've been working with Puff Daddy and some others about how do we have action steps moving forward. One thing that's been discussed from several elected officials, I've been getting all kind of calls, is that, as the pastor alluded to, I feel as if, and I'm being candid, y'all know me, and I think Black folk have to, again, not one, be afraid of Black folk, but secondly, we have to put Black folk first. And when I say we put Black folk first, I mean we own our own political agendas. That means we own our own political capital. That means we own our own economic agendas. We own our own educational agendas. And in order to do that, I think we have to not be afraid to say that we may be stepping away from some other folks, and we're going to focus on us. We're going to be calling for something called the Black Liberty Party to be created, and again, it'll come out next week. And essentially, it's not a large Democrat, not a large Republican. We're not developing a third party, But if you look back in history, the Liberty Party was initially the party in which Black folk ran under during Reconstruction. And you will see that's where we made several gains, 14th Amendment, 15th Amendment, and so forth, dismantled. And then subsequently, Reverend Jackson tried to do something similar, and it didn't quite work out because he wanted to make a third party. But when I say Black Liberty Party, I'm talking about us. You can be independent, you can be Democrat, you can be Republican, but Black folk as a whole, and all of those individuals who don't understand how local government works, who don't understand the tie between state government, and all the individuals who say that we need political and policy change, we have to galvanize and mobilize ourselves as a people in order to bring forth leverage to be recognized in a certain manner. So we'll be asking for, and I'm just going to be very brief, 3 specific things. I think they're things that all of us can get behind. One, every state in the United States of America should have a chief diversity officer, similar to what we have with Dr. Underwood. That's a given. Secondly, every municipality in the United States of America, whether you live in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, whether you live in Norfolk, Virginia, whether you live in Atlanta, Georgia, or whether you live in Portland, Oregon, every municipality in the United States should have a commission for African American advancement. And it's through those commissions in which you start to design policies to look to address health disparities like we've been discussing. When you look to discuss economic disparities, when you look to discuss educational disparities, you use that platform to be, or excuse me, that vehicle to address these local issues. And then lastly, there's a need for new blood, which I think you're going to see a lot of new people run for office as they're energized. And we're calling for the support of 1,000 newly elected officials who are Black. And that comes from the local, state, and federal level. We're going to be putting a large emphasis on the local and state level. And again, it's all about owning our political capital. You can be a Democrat and you can be a Republican, you can be an independent, you can be whatever. But if you're not, one, being recognized and treated as a human being in whatever entity which you choose to be a part of, you have to decide how you're going to take back your own being. And that's what we're going to be focusing on. And again, I hope you all will join us. You'll hear more information coming out on Monday. But again, I think when you ask that question, Carlos, we can ask, but until we start to educate our own folk about why we need Chief Booms across these police departments, until we start to educate our folk about how Jay Jones works with Councilwoman Graves, and how even a professor or a former councilman has to work with both of those entities to get stuff passed, until we do that, we're going to be lost. And I think we don't have to ask white people or anyone else. This is not reverse racism or anything of that nature, but we can do it ourselves. We can work with each other to teach each other, to run and support each other, to do what we need to do for our community. And I think that it's time, and you will see an influx of people who agree.
Right.
Definitely.
Go ahead, Rev. I hear you.
No, I mean,
it's Ali. I see.
No, I mean I mean, when we talk about empowerment, right?
Mhm.
That's exactly what we're saying. You cannot be in relationship. You know, my side hustle, if I can say this, my side hustle is relationship work and counseling and therapy and all that. And from a therapeutic relationship perspective, you can't have a healthy relationship if one person does not understand who they are. Right? There has to be a whole person and a whole person to have a whole healthy relationship. And when we find ourselves in this deficit of understanding and believing that our only salvation, our only sense of being, our only sense of identity runs through somebody else, you will constantly be at a place of deficiency, and you will constantly be at a place of inadequacy, and you will constantly be at a place of disrespect. And so there has to be this understanding of self. And what you're seeing and hearing from these young people who are protesting and who are making their voices heard is they're saying that we have dignity, right? There is a sense of dignity. The word is incredibly interesting because for an older generation, this intergenerational thing is incredibly powerful. Because the older generation is saying, when you do this, you do it with respect, you do it with dignity, right? That you keep yourself about you, that you don't lose it, right? Because somebody else is, you know, doing something. Now you keep your dignity, right? That this whole idea of being dignified, right? Even when you're insulted, be dignified. Even when you're being abused, be dignified. Operate and conduct yourself with a sense of dignity. Well, for the younger generation, their position is dignity is letting you know I matter, right? The dignity begins in saying, yo, I'm somebody. Right, that's the dignity. The dignity is not in necessarily, as they understand it, in, you know, the stuff that you do to me, and I withhold it, and I operate with this sense of character, and I operate with this sense of, you know, fortitude and stick-to-itiveness. The theology has shifted to God has fearfully and wonderfully created me, and you are offending me, and I have the right to say something about that. And so as the theology begins to shift, right, and the thinking, we also have to parallel this thing into understanding what healthy, and I use that term deliberately, what healthy Christianity looks like, right? And when I say healthy Christianity, I'm talking about who do we model? And if we model Jesus Christ, then we model the revolutionary, right? We model the person who spoke truth to power. We model the person who understood empire as he understood the Roman Empire controlling, you know, the Israelite nation and the nations around that, and speaking to that and understanding that dynamic. We understand that we follow the person, and this becomes the hard part, who ultimately went to capital punishment and died as a result of the capital punishment of the day, right? And what that meant, you know, crucifixion was a governmental execution, right? And so when we understand who we follow, right, then the Christianity becomes much more healthy, because it becomes not so much about the by and by and you know, I'm gonna hold on and wait to it, right? But it becomes about how do we operate and how does this thing of faith look now? Mm-hmm. And so part of that is saying, because we are created to who we are, and because we are who we are, that we do things like Dr. Bellamy is talking about, right? We do talk about how we matter and those kinds of things. It is, the time has come for us to have an agenda, right? So that Democrat or Republican coming to us, we say, okay, but this is what we need out the deal.
Exactly.
You know what I'm saying?
It has to be transactional.
Right. This is what we need out the deal. You want, watch this, and let's push it. Latinos do it, right? LGBTQ communities do it, right? Jewish communities do it. We need to stop being taken for granted politically, or they're just always automatically going to do this, but say, listen, this is what we need. This is what we come into the table with. What can you do about that? Because this is what it's going to take for us to work with you, right? It's no longer about the assumption, right? Because we have sense of self, we have sense of identity. I want to say right here on this call that Dr. Bellamy, Police Chief Boone, Councilwoman Congress, I'm speaking prophetically.
Speak
right?
it.
Yeah. Councilwoman Graves, right? Brother Jones, whatever is needed in this circle. I am willing, New Calvary is willing to work and partner to make community better for us. And so whatever it is we need to do, I'm saying this publicly, this is getting recorded. This is, people are watching and signing in. Chief, whatever you need from New Calvary, we down the road with that. Wes, whatever you need from me. Jay, whatever you need from me, whatever we can partner with. And you know how we do, whatever it is you need, let us work with that. You know what I'm saying? And let us talk about honestly. And even if we don't agree on everything, let's talk about how we make that happen.
New Calvary has been a historic presence in the city of Norfolk with regard to civil rights and community activism for decades. I remember that as a child growing up. And so it is amazing how just that building has drawn you there, Pastor Small, for such a time as this. You know, that is absolutely amazing.
Yeah, that's good.
So, look, so I'm looking at the time here, but I definitely want to take in some of the questions that have come from those who are watching. And then I'm going to pose a final kind of close-up question, because I don't want this to be just a discussion. I really want us to, because you guys, I have respect for all of you, but really, how do we move past this? What are some of the things? And Wes, you've already laid out some of the actual items there. But we have Audra Moore, who's saying in the conversation or on the table, who's fighting for people of the trans experience who are also people of color?
That's it's, and I'm gonna jump out ahead of that. I'm gonna jump ahead of this and say regretfully, and I say this regretfully, it is not the church. Tragically, the church has been silent on connection and relationship with the entire LGBTQ community. And we need to understand that they are our people. They are our community. They belong to us. And it moves past whether or not you agree with their lifestyle. But we cannot declare Black Lives Matter and then be exclusive. That's hypocritical, right? It's a hypocritical statement and a hypocritical position. It was part of the problem that the civil rights movement had, as they talked about this equality with African Americans in this country, but then they would shun women or not believe women had a place or a right in terms of the dynamic of the country. And so as we talk about empowerment, what does that mean? And so we need to empower and understand that violence can happen through ignorance on all levels. And we need to be courageous enough to include and to speak to those kinds of injustices on all levels, right? It's not about whether or not I agree with the lifestyle, right? And I'm just talking in general right now. It's not about whether or not I agree or whether or not I have a certain theological position. Nobody should be dehumanized. That's the point, right? That if we understand our Christological understanding, right, then we understand how we treat people as human beings and as God's creation and with dignity.
Amen. Appreciate that. So Javon, I think it's Javon or Lavon Pledger asked the question, and I'm going to pose this back to you, Councilwoman. Norfolk St. Paul's is undergoing redevelopment. Can we expect changes in the development or even the funding as we're looking at this COVID-19?
Well, everybody has had to take a little bit of bite of the apple or to make a little bit of a sacrifice in terms of funding in COVID-19. We are facing about a $40 million shortfall in the city of Norfolk, and that has meant that we've had to make some very difficult decisions. And I don't expect that will be different for Jay at the state level and Lieutenant Governor at the state level when it comes to their budget. Because when people are not working and businesses are closed, then, revenue is not being generated. What we've done is we've been very responsible with the funding that we do have. And because we started collecting money in a tax increase about a year before, we had a People First partner in place. We have sufficient funding to be able to continue the people services that we are offering without any shortages of services. We won't be shorting any of the services to our residents in the St. Paul's quadrant, specifically in Tidewater Gardens, as it pertains to the redevelopment of St. Paul's.
And so I've got another question here, and I'm going to pose this one to you, Mr. Lieutenant Governor. So color legislation, what can we expect to protect our vulnerable communities post-COVID? Is there any discussion regarding that?
Yes, and thanks so much for allowing me to rejoin. And let me just give a quick warning. We have a huge thunderstorm that's coming over Fairfax where I am, so you both may hear that in the background. And it knocked our internet out, so I think our discussion is too good, and somebody's trying to interfere with it right now. So if I do jump off for that reason, my apologies. I'll come back on. But I actually went ahead and formed a COVID-19 racial disparities task force, which has been done in other states, including in Michigan, where a good friend of mine, who's the Lieutenant Governor of Michigan, Garland Gilchrist, is working with Gretchen Whitmer, the governor there. And the purpose, obviously, was to focus in on the ways that the COVID-19 pandemic is impacting Black and Brown communities so much more substantially and disproportionately than other communities. So, it started with the startling statistics that, our Black and Brown communities in Virginia are about 27.5% of our overall general population, and yet they are nearly 67% of the COVID-19 confirmed cases. So you think about that, we're about a quarter of the population, and we're nearly 2/3 of the COVID-19 cases. And so we want to quickly, not only get to the bottom of that, some of the answers, we all, because of our experiences, know what's driving some of that. There are disproportionate numbers of the so-called essential workers, some of whom, of course, are in our families. I know they're in mine, who are having to go back before in the phase 1 and phase 2 reopening. So they are more readily and more frequently exposed to potential coronavirus infection. We also know because of healthcare issues. Again, this all goes back to the living monuments that we talked about of oppression and the effects of it. For people who don't have standard housing, social distancing is not that easy when you have to live 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 to a small place, and if one person gets infected, then we know that spreads quickly. And again, not to mention, as from the beginning of this, we had a twin crisis on our hands, which was both a healthcare crisis with this pandemic, but also an economic crisis, because at state level, we are, decisions were made to close businesses, to close gyms and restaurants, bars and theaters. I actually was at the state level, I think the first one to recommend that we close all of our K through 12 schools. I know that has a huge impact in our communities, but on the day that we made that recommendation, March the 18th, we had 77 confirmed COVID-19 cases in Virginia, 77. And then now, a little over 2 months later, we're over 40,000. So that's how quickly and exponentially the spread of this virus was going. So we knew we had to take pretty dramatic steps and bold and swift action to try to curb the spread. But of course, if you're having people stay home, close their small businesses, they then can't generate income, and they still have their bills, their rents, their mortgages, their insurance, their taxes. And so we have also proposed some economic relief around this to try to create a state level funding. And these are things that we've been advocating for now for a couple months to relieve small businesses. Even as they're opening, they're still struggling. Our employees are getting unemployment insurance. We recommended that be increased. Fortunately, the federal government came in and did increase that. So the max you can get in Virginia is $378 per week of unemployment insurance. But because of some of the stimulus legislation that was passed, that was bumped up an additional $600 per eligible applicant. So there's a huge difference between being able to get $378 a week and $978 a week for a family, particularly if you're taking care of young people or of parents. That we have a lot of sandwich generation, folks who are carrying the load for a lot of people. So we wanted to, again, delve in with this task force, and we have, formed that. We're rolling out the members of it, but also some of the things that we are focusing in on. But the other thing is, we don't want to, if we find ourselves in a situation like this again, or when we find ourselves in a situation like this again, to be, caught flat-footed as a nation or as a state, because we know, particularly when you don't have a federal response that is coordinated, that is in any way effective. You had, states that are fighting against each other to get testing kits and PPE, and it's a free-for-all, and so no one has what they need, and it's a public policy nightmare in so many ways. But of course, we know the true, tried and true saying that, when America gets a cold, Black and brown communities catch the flu. And in this context, we've seen that. And so the disproportionate number of deaths, we called for the recording of the deaths so that we could know exactly, how big an impact this was having in our community. So that is one big aspect of it, getting to the root causes, but it's also taking action, because again, these are things that have gone on for generations. If you didn't study anything, if you didn't, have one data gathering operation, I bet everyone, on this call would be able to pinpoint at least 3 or 4 or 5 significant factors, risk factors in the Black community in particular, but in the Black and Latinx community that make us more susceptible to every conceivable harm: healthcare, economic.
I think we may.
This will be a sustained effort.
Right.
This will be a sustained effort with the COVID-19 task force, but also with the efforts that jointly we're all going to take, the state and local levels working together. We have got to begin to rebuild our infrastructure in our communities by, again, tearing down these living monuments to the discrimination that has left us in the positions that we're in. But we're not just standing there. We're not just waiting for permission to, activate our communities to start to deal with some of these harms. We're all getting engaged and working together. And I think that's going to be the key going forward, is that we're all working together and, taking initiative.
Appreciate it.
I hope you have some Hampton Roads representatives on that commission, Lieutenant Governor.
Oh, you know we do. The 757 is well represented, and we might need some more. So I think you just volunteered.
I appreciate it. So, looking at the hour now, I want to just kind of pose a kind of a wrap-up reflection question here to the group, and less. This the challenge. 2 minutes or less. But how do we move beyond this tipping point? What are we actually asking for as a community? Yes, we see protests, but what are we actually asking for? And this goes back to what I dovetailed about earlier. We have these moments of activism. We're going out, shutting down streets, we're protesting, but there's very many times that not follow up on the advocacy piece and meeting with our legislators, meeting with the decision makers, and then also identifying what is it that we need to change in policy. And so I just point that out there just as a closing thought from all your different vantage points. Reverend Small from the religious community, so I'll throw it out there, and whoever wants to go first, you can. But what is it? How do we move forward? What are some thoughts?
All right. Well, I'm gonna go first so I can be fast, so I can be the quickest. Bottom line, what we need is to organize. We need to discuss and really operate in a sense of agenda in terms of what it is we need as communities, and we need to partner with our officials, our leadership, and really work to do that, and really believe in ourselves enough that we can do that. It is more than just like you said, it is more than just the advocacy, it's more than just the march. It has to move to a place of organization that transforms into policy that is truly changed and adjusted. And those in power are those who can help do that.
Definitely. So, Councilwoman, I'll pitch it over to you, even at the local level. What can individuals do?
At the local level, I want to take 2 seconds to shout out our peaceful protesters and just say thank you to them for being peaceful and orderly and working with our police department, and a shout out to our police chief and police department for all that they do in terms of working with our peaceful protesters, because that goes a long way. I think that we can work better with our boots on the ground, heels on the ground individuals who are out there coming up with ideas and coming up with solutions. I think one of the things that we also have to do is acknowledge that there is a problem. And not only that Black people are acknowledging that there is a problem, white people need to acknowledge that there is a problem too, so that we can start to work together, because we didn't create this problem by ourselves, and we're not going to solve this problem by ourselves. So we need everybody on both sides, or on all sides in all communities, to acknowledge that there is an issue. And that way we can work together on solutions that will rise the tide for everybody.
Appreciate that. Chief Boone, I'm going to actually kick this back over to you because, in your perspective, what can we do to work with the police department, and what the police department can continue to do to engage the community?
Okay, so I want to go back a couple questions ago. Someone asked about the LGBTQ community. Can you hear me?
Yeah,
I can hear him. Can you? Yeah, we can hear you.
All right. So I wanted to highlight a policy that we created to help our officers interface with the LGBTQ plus community. And basically what this spells out is how we treat them with dignity and respect, and how do we go about interfacing with them when we contact them, whether it's just an investigation or an interview, or we actually are placing them in custody. I just wanted to highlight, because we are the only police department in the state that actually has that policy. With respect to George Floyd, police executives are going to have to make massive sweeps. We won't be policing the way we've had in the past. That incident was a game changer. We can no longer speak in subtleties about the relationship between the African-American community and how we interface with them by way of enforcing the law. There's some things we have to address, whether it's systemic racism, because that is an issue. That's an issue in all organizations. I know going forward that the community will not tolerate another one of these incidents. They're going to be at the table. They're going to have real input, and they're going to see that input. They're going to want to see that input documented. The other piece of that, though, is we have to stop sending a badge and a gun to address generational poverty, to address social ills such as mental health, homelessness, things of that nature. So you ask, how can you help us? Take some of that pressure off us in that regard.
Appreciate it. Up to you, Dr. Bellamy.
Sure. Just in closing, thanks again to you, Carlos, for having us, man. It's been a very, very good conversation. And furthermore, this platform that you're using is really cool, man. Like I've been on a few of these Zoom meetings, and this is by far like one of the nicest ones. So much respect to you in that regard. It was getting tense, man. We had to light it up a little bit. I'll say this, man. Chief Boone and I served on the board together. I've known my brother Justin for years. My sister Councilwoman Graves for a while now. We've been rocking for a long time. My brother in the movement, Reverend Small and Carlos, we've known each other for I don't even know how long. Whenever I call, you're there, just like all of you. Listen, a lot of us, we get along. When we get to these positions, we work well together. I think there's a couple of things that we can do. One, dispel this notion that there's jealousy and envy amongst us, because more often than not, there isn't. A lot of us, from my experience, a lot of us get along very well. Of course, you have apples and oranges, and some people rub each other the wrong way. But for the most part, we're supporting each other. We love each other. We do the things that sometimes people say we can't. So let's continue that. And then the second part, I just want us to love ourselves and not be ashamed to be your most authentic and genuine self. When I'm in my classroom as the chair of political science department at Virginia State, I tell my students all the time, we tell our scholars, you are the best of the best. Love yourself. There's nothing wrong with you. We have elected officials at the highest level of the land, our lieutenant governor, our chief, who's literally on CNN everywhere, every time you turn around. we are the ones that are going to change this, and there's another group of folks who are looking for us to do the same. So let's just continue to pour into them. I have ideas. I lay some out. Councilwoman Graves, Fairfax. We all have ideas, and that's okay. We're not a monolithic group. Like, there's plenty of things to do and plenty of ways for us to move forward. Let's not knock each other down when other people have ideas. If it's not for you, then it's not for you. But we can continue to love each other and be our most authentic selves and go change the world. And we will do that. So I'm looking forward to continuing to work with all of you.
That's a good close, Reverend. That's a good close, Reverend.
I already passed you the collection plate. I was looking online. I'm gonna send information tomorrow. Friend, just a second ago, who is Reverend Small? I'm about to go find him. I just texted him. I'm coming to go find him myself.
He the bomb now. He is the bomb.
Well, I'm a believer. I was about to shout him here.
So, Lieutenant Governor, I'll leave the final word with you in wrapping that up.
Well, let me just say, this entire panel is a difficult act to follow because you have just brilliant, committed public servants, and I'm grateful to every single one of you for your leadership, for your care for the communities that you serve, which ultimately is all of us. And my brother Clanton, you've always been somebody who's lifted everyone up and brought us all together. So thank you for doing that in real time at a critical moment in our history as a Commonwealth. And again, I also want to shout out Chief Boone, and my kids know you from CNN too, Chief. So they're watching, see you there all the time, and they're very proud. And Reverend Small.
Don't tell him that. We still got to work with him. Don't tell him that.
They don't want me to jet.
Comes up. Y'all talk to the councilwoman. Put some special provisions there, but and she's been an incredible leader for many, many years. And we were just together recently at a wonderful opening of a tenant management corporation, and that was something that reflected to me the best of who we are, and that was before COVID-19. That's when people were saying, as a community, we're going to give people housing. Reverend Small and Dr. Bellamy, you all talk about breaking generational curses. Families have them, but you know what? So do cities, towns, and states. and nations. And as difficult as these crises have been, again, healthcare, economic, and now with regard to, police brutality in the Black and brown communities. I mean, this is the most extraordinarily difficult time that I have ever lived through. I know in my 41 years on this earth. And, but I think that we all know that there is an incredible lesson in this kind of adversity. And the thing I think that I have been lifted up by, and frankly, I think the lesson that I want to keep from this is you see how extraordinarily we have adapted under circumstances. Every conceivable structure that we have in our society and our economy has not only been impacted by this, but has had to adjust to this. And so when people tell us in better times that things aren't possible, I think we have to start asking the question, why not? Why can't we break that generational curse as a city and as a town, as a county? Because when everything came to bear on all of us together, we as a nation, Congress found $3 trillion overnight to begin to deal with issues that more people told us we didn't have the resources to deal with. But when we had no other choice but to give resources to our community, we found a way to do it. So we've got it in even better economic times, and it'll be tough. But find a way to fund all of our schools, to rebuild them, to make sure that they reflect the highest value of our children in our school system, to make sure our housing is available, to make sure that our healthcare system is not only available to people, but that people will finally get the level of healthcare, and it should be universal, that all of us need and all of us deserve. So when we had to do it, we did it. And I don't want us to miss that lesson, which means we have the ability to do it. And so I'm very proud of each one of you for stepping up at this particular moment. It has been incredible. Again, capped off today by the announcement of the removal of the monuments and that down payment on the removal of those other living monuments that each one of you every single day is working to eradicate from our communities and to build people and communities up and to not tear them down. So God bless you guys. Stay inspired, stay encouraged, take care of yourselves. And we are grateful to every single one of you. We're going to get through this on the other side. And history's going to look kindly on the courage that you had right now.
Appreciate it. Thank you all. I want to thank everyone who's joined us this evening. I know that we lost Jay. He had some other things, and Marquise, but I think all of those who are still here, bouncing in and out. But great dynamic conversation. One of the things I set this platform up to do of engagement, as elected officials, to engage our constituents. But most importantly, I learned from my pastor, who's there. I called him, you missed it earlier, he's my pastor, his brother. But it's about raising the level of consciousness and making people think more than just hearing the noise, but really to begin to think about how do we move forward. And that's where this quote from my brother, our late brother Martin Luther King Jr. talked about, our lives begin to end the day we become silent about the things that matter. And I think that when we begin to talk about it, and just like that monument, everything, it didn't happen overnight, but people weren't silent about it. They kept on. And so even though it's been 400 years, there's still time to make great change. And so I encourage all of those who are watching near and far and near, to speak up, to be involved, and to go like what I said about that three-legged stool. When the protests are over, and I know today they had the first memorial service for Brother Floyd and his family, and to memorialize there. But when the protests are over, continue to remember that there is other things and other work that needs to be done. And so if you're not a part of a group of like the National Urban League or the NAACP or some local group there, get involved. They need your voices. They need your time. They need your energy. They need your resources. Get involved in your local churches and in your places of worship. There is work that needs to be done. And it's, make sure that you lend your voice. And most importantly, also identify the policies that need to be changed. And if people aren't changing the policy, get new people in there. I think you talked about that as well, Brother Dr. Bellamy. So with that, I thank you all for joining us tonight. I think we've had a dynamic conversation. I look forward to having another one in about 2 weeks. But it's time to move forward. And I appreciate everybody. Y'all have a great evening. Peace, love. Be good.
God bless y'all. Thank you, guys.
All right, be well. Take
All
care.
right.
Thank you very much, Carlos.
Thank you, Carlos. Thank you.
Wait a minute, Wes. Hold on.